Hello, everybody. Adam Parks here with another episode of Receivables Podcast. Today, I'm here with one of my favorite guests, Mr. Rob Grafrath. Always enjoy when he comes on to have a conversation with me, because whether it's in passing at a conference or we're sitting here preparing for a podcast or webinar call, I learn more than a little bit from every one of these conversations. So, Rob, thank you so much for coming back again, having another conversation with me. I really appreciate you educating me and sharing your insights.
Thank you. Yeah, this is just I'm a kid in a candy store. I love talking about this stuff. With our last one with the sci-fi stuff, that was just too much fun. We're gonna have some fun today as well.
Look, there's always a lot to learn around artificial intelligence. And I think as an industry, one of the challenges that we have is things have started to move so fast that I don't even know that we're using the right language or that we truly understand the nuts and bolts behind the tools that we're evaluating. We're looking at end results and we're so focused on the end game that I think we need to take a few minutes and think about the opening and how these things actually function. But Rob, before we get into that, for anyone who has not been as lucky as me to get to spend some time with you at the conferences and on calls, could you tell everyone a little about yourself and how you got to the seat that you're in today?
Right. Yeah, I started as a debt collector back in 1999. Did that for maybe a year and a half. That was not my calling, but it was the industry that I ended up staying in for the next 26 years. Went over to IT, did management, did development for a number of years, and then IT management. Was the vice president of enterprise systems at a major healthcare debt purchaser for a good long while. And most recently, did technical consulting independently for the first part of the year. And now I am head of business development at CSS Impact.
Well, very excited to have you working with an organization that's so well known for their use of artificial intelligence in CRM systems and having a baseline from a system of record and kind of a holistic ecosystem. So I felt like that made you the perfect person to have this conversation with today, just because you've got so many different perspectives that you're able to bring together into the conversation. As we start talking about artificial intelligence and the tool sets that are available and really what the industry is starting to look at and use, it feels like we might not be using the right vocabulary. And as you and I were planning for this call, we started talking about some of the language that we're hearing in the marketplace and on webinars and other places that just might not be correct. So why don't we kind of start at the beginning? I guess is probably the best place to go and talk about how artificial intelligence was kind of came to be to what it is today, and how the language of those different levels of tool capabilities have ultimately impacted the growth of artificial intelligence.
Yeah. All right. So buckle up, because although this is very new to a lot of us, it started, let's say, maybe around 2020 when ChatGPT came out. It became really popularized that, oh, wow, this stuff is amazing. And that was because we started chatting with it. We could write something down and have it respond. And boy, it sounded like a human. This is amazing stuff. But AI has been around since probably, I don't know, 70s or 80s. It's been around for a very long time, kind of simmering behind the scenes. And the uses of the terms, things like using the term neural network, this was something that the early AI pioneers, they really were using as an analogy. And anyone that knows like how brain chemistry works, the way that a neuron fires, there's a certain threshold that it has to meet as a whole electrochemical system, but that a lot of the same concepts were sort of analogous in computer science, where you had particular connections between data points, and there were thresholds, and there were multiple inputs multiplied by this threshold. You would give it a certain output. So because there was a sort of a close analogy, they were using that term. But then I think sometimes people think that they go a little bit too far with that idea, and thinking that this is a brain inside of a computer. That this is one of the first things I want to make sure that we knock completely off the pedestal. A brain is a electrochemical system that is plastic. It's constantly learning, constantly changing the chemistry and the connections in your brain. A neural network in the computer sense, in computer terms, this is a statistical system. Think of it as statistics on steroids. like given this set of inputs, and maybe that set of inputs is trillions upon trillions of words off of the internet and off of books and everything that the models have been trained off of, the ways that humans speak and the ways that words and sentences connect together, and the ideas that we as humans throughout all of this written text that the new large language models are built off of. It's just taking what normally would be said under certain circumstances and it's saying statistically this, given this as your original wording, this is what follows. And it's literally as it's replying to you, it is literally building word for word, given what I have in my large language model and given the input and given what I've said so far, this is the wording that should follow that. And that really is a mathematical statistical behavior, not a true neural thinking
Not an
in the terms of
intelligence.
human thinking.
Yeah.
Right. So then you have people that use AI to describe a deterministic system. So deterministic, defining our terms here, that is a true false if then logic that given a certain input, you will always have a certain output. There's no wiggle room in a deterministic system. And you can make very complex deterministic systems and call them AI. And often, people have, but mainly what we're talking about AI in recent terms, if you have a deterministic system, you're just talking about good old fashioned programming. And then I'd say the first place where AI had taken root in our industry is in machine learning. When you start to see propensity to pay scoring happening, those are actual AI in use. We can call it AI because that's what they were calling it as well. And that also is just applied statistics. So there's nothing wrong with calling that AI. I'm fine with it, but let's make sure that we know if someone's saying, oh, and we're going to tell you what's the next best account to work. We're going to tell you what to do with this account. Is that machine learning or is that a LLM? Two very different things, not the same tool. So much more we could get into.
So it's interesting. Let me kind of go back to this and make sure that we're, for the less technical folks, that we're having the same conversation, right? So when we talk about artificial intelligence on the whole, it's a much broader perspective. We've got our large language models that we're used to playing with these days, the chat GPTs, Perplexity, Claude, whatever your favorite flavor is fine. And then you have this, let's call it probability driven statistics. I always like to say that when we look at artificial intelligence, that it's a complex math problem. And the most important thing in math is the order of operations. So as we look at, and I know we're going to talk about prompting and things, I always think about the order of operations being one of those most important ingredients in terms of those inputs. Historically, when we think about artificial intelligence in the debt collection industry, it kind of kicked off with companies that were starting with that type of what's the next account to work. And then it started to evolve into not only what's the next best account to work, but what's the next best action on the account that you're going to work next. And I feel like that's where we started to see this kind of growth. Now, a lot of those original scoring companies are no longer in the industry. And I think some of them probably came out earlier than the industry was ready for, or even maybe earlier than the technology was truly prepared to add the level of value that it needed to add in order to hit the price point that was being charged at the time. And now we're starting to look at what are these other options in terms of how we're going to continue to see this evolution. And we've been in the speech to text to model to text back to speech again kind of mentality for a long time. I hear organizations are working on this speech to model the speech technology, which would reduce latency times and potentially provide new interesting opportunities for the industry to deploy it. But the industry is looking at AI from a variety of different paths. Now, in your roles throughout the industry, where have you seen artificial intelligence be the most impactful?
I would say where I first saw the most impact was on the propensity scoring that we were just talking about in recent times. But today that's almost table stakes. I don't know if I would call it passe, but it's something that you can do, you should do. There's plenty of products to do that and tools to do that with. You can hire your own decision scientist, or you can figure out how to do it yourself. I don't want to say it's boring to talk about, but it's
No, it's
It's
still
not the
important. It's
bleeding edge, right?
yeah.
So the hot stuff we're talking about these days with generative AI, like that based off of LLMs is a whole other game. There's also the speech and audio based AI, which is not the same thing. So don't get speech analytics and the sentiment analysis mixed up and confused with LLM, because and I think this is something where people get a little bit confused. They think that when you're doing sentimental analysis, that all you're doing is taking the words that are being said and transcribing that to text and then deciding, is this person upset with the way that this conversation is going? That's not necessarily the case, right? Your audio based AI systems, they're reading tone and cadence, and they're not just taking pure text, but also taking text and tone. And that's something with CSS, we have our we call it Talk IQ Plus, that it's listening to your call, because we have our integrated dialer that people on our system, the calls are going through the dialer. The call isn't going well, and there's no mistaking that from a human's perspective. But if you had just used pure text analysis on that, it might not sound that bad. If it were someone said, okay, fine, I'll pay the bill, that is a upset consumer. Fine, whatever, that. But if it's okay, that's
Cadence
fine,
and
I'll pay
tone
the
is
bill.
playing a major role in that, right? It's not just about what is being said, it's about how it's being said and how it's being delivered.
Right, right. And so with a system like ours that can both detect and then store that information later for review or for later mining, that's a whole other tool set that sits on top of and coincides with, because you still want that call transcript. You need the speech to text AI, which is again another technology all in and of itself, aside from just LLMs. And then the other tooling, really, it's all about, there's so much that's all about tooling, about having these systems work together and connect to each other and be able to not just have a pure LLM. If you just have just one little LLM agent and you're leaning on this guy to be everything. You remember back when we started with ChatGPTs and you would ask it some math problems, and boy, it was it was bad at math. I don't know if you remember that.
A
But
little bit.
this was before it was embarrassingly bad at math, and this was before they had started integrating other tooling, so that if it's asked a math problem, now they have the tools set up so that it'll take that question you asked, this divided by that plus that, it can take it and run it, write some quick Python code or something like that behind the scenes, run the code and have the code, the deterministic system. You remember we said deterministic earlier? If then it's pure logic, no wrong. There's one way to answer a math problem in that case, right? So it runs some deterministic code and outputs the answer and then reads you back that answer. So tooling enabling let's say if you have a chatbot, that chatbot needs to have a calculator that is not an LLM based, right? That's not pulling from the language model, but is literally just calling out and doing calculations using a calculator tool. And this is where you start to chain together judge LLMs that sit on top of the LLMs that are doing the behaviors. And another term I'm going to throw out there, so brace yourselves, is MCP, the Model Context Protocol Server. So an MCP server is an AI developer's way of basically making an interface. So making you can think of APIs as interfaces into your system. An MCP server is like an API into your system, into your database, that the LLM in turn then interfaces with. So in your prompting, you say, perform this action. So let's say you have a voice bot, it's on a call with the consumer, and in your prompting for that voice bot, you've said, if the consumer says that I refuse to pay this debt, then I want you to run an action code in our system. I want you to run the RTP action code. So the LLM, you do not give the LLM access to do that in your system. No.
Fair.
Bad idea. Have an MCP server that sits between the LLM and your system. The LLM says, hey, we're supposed to run the RTP action code. MCP server, then it has the code, the deterministic code, the hard code, so to speak, to, okay, here's the API call that I'm going to make. And it can also be programmed to check whether what the LLM is asking for. It's asking to do something that it shouldn't be able to do. And it can kick back a response to the LLM and say, can't do that, try again, go back and think twice. So it's really MCP becomes both your security gateway, kind of your tooling to make sure that your system can do things. So you have this perception that the LLM makes the system do things. We have this agent copilot, which is just about the coolest tool ever here in the CSS impact tool set, where agent is typing, they say that RTP action again that we were just talking about. If the agent says status this as a refusal to pay, and then lo and behold, their screen just now it's moved and a window's popped, and now you have the action code filled out, and it has a refusal to pay, and it has a nice little summary of the conversation as a note that's ready to be added. Feels like magic. Really, it's the LLM calling the MCP running an API call into your system, and then next thing you know, the system has performed the action. So all of that tooling kind of working together, that's what some of the best things that are coming out today end up being created.
Well, everything is created out of necessity. I like what you're saying here about creating this, having this MCP that sits in between the AI related tool and the system of record, so that there's a replaceability to the LLM model almost. Like one, it's a protection layer, but two, it's also a future proofing layer, because now I'm in a position where, I mean, just look at how the tools have moved so fast over the last couple of months, right? Looking at how Gemini breaks all the benchmarks, so ChatGPT releases 5.2, and we just see this constant movement. So we really don't know who's going to win the AI race at this point, right? Like we know who is going to win the search race for the World Wide Web at this point, right? Like Google has cornered that marketplace. But when it comes to artificial intelligence, we really have no idea who's going to be in control at any point going forward. So future-proofing our organizations and making sure that our connectivity to these tools is running through some sort of a protocol, like you're saying, the MCP, that creates that, call it gateway in and out of our system of record. Also, so that the AI model can't just go changing things, because we've seen, or at least we've heard stories. I've never seen it in person, but we've heard stories about the AI going rogue and changing all of the things, and now you got to find your way back again.
Yeah, and that makes it interchangeable. You can change out the back end. If you didn't like the outputs you were getting using your Claude-based model, now you can use your ChatGPT-based model, OpenAI rather, most likely. So the
Makes
other,
sense.
so tool set wise, just kind of want to throw another one at you. Brace yourself. Retrieval augmented generation, RAG, they call this. So let's kind of talk about what that is and how it works, just in case if you're talking to some IT guy and they say, oh, and you're going to use RAG to make sure that your outputs are in line with your knowledge base. It's like, why am I going to use a RAG? Well, it's a lot
Honestly,
cleaner.
it's the first time I'm hearing the terminology, so I'm curious. Again, this is where I say that I learn something from every conversation I have with you.
Yeah. Why use a RAG? So imagine, if you will, you're a very organized, you've got a great organization. You have Nancy over there in compliance, and she has written this beautiful backlog of all of these policies that your collectors need to follow. You have all of these wonderful training materials. You have the FDCPA and Reg F and all of these regulations. And now you have an LLM, and you want to be able to tell the LLM, okay, when I tell you I want to do a thing, so we have, let's say our, I'll throw another tool out there for the CSS side, the management copilot. So we have a back office copilot so that management can ask questions about the data in their system. Well, you probably want to expose to that management copilot the FDCPA, Reg F, and all of your training materials. So how do you do that? That's where the RAG comes in. You take that knowledge base, let's say the FDCPA or whatever, and you run it through an algorithm. We won't get into too many details, but it's stored in they call it a vector database, where now it's almost like it's like giving the LLM a table of contents, so to speak. So if I ask you a question that has to do with the 7 and 7 rules, like if I ask as a management, here's a great example. Find the violations to the 7 and 7 rule. Okay. Without a RAG, it's going to go back to the LLM, just the base model. Let's say that's OpenAI's model, and it's going to scour the whole knowledge base of what it has from the internet history that it's been trained on. How will it know what it's looking for? It might be able to find that, because 7 and 7, that sounds like very specific, but maybe it will, maybe it won't. But if you use retrieval augmented generation, before that prompt goes to and gets consumed by your OpenAI LLM, it goes to your vector store and it finds here's a let's say lookup from the table of contents that has to do with 7 and 7, and oh, this came from the Reg E documentation, so it pulls the relevant paragraph or two from Reg E, whatever snippet, or it summarizes a whole section from Reg E, and then that alongside your prompt gets bundled together to the package, sent over to the OpenAI backend, and now it has the context, the true, like, meaningful, useful context from your business and from your industry to work with, rather than just kind of going out and trying to figuring things out on its own. Powerful stuff.
Well, context is mission critical because these models are great, but they're only great if they understand the context in which you're asking the question. Unless you're providing really detailed prompting and you're going through the engineering side of creating those prompts, but that context is everything.
Context is king, really. The context of, and this is where I think people feel like LLMs are learning sometimes when they really aren't technically learning, because
Yes.
as you interface with and this a lot of the times goes into a ChatGPT conversation. I'm talking to ChatGPT all day about certain things, and when I enter a new conversation, it's referencing things about me that I've talked about it with from prior conversations. It's still telling me advice on how to help with my consulting business, even though I've kind of turned the dial down on that since I've started here at CSS. But because it knows me, it knows I'm interested in that, and that looks like learning, right? What is it? What is happening there? All of those conversation histories are summarized in those in snippets of context windows. Very old conversation, the older it is, the more condensed and summarized that text ends up becoming. But as I keep interfacing with this tool, this is just one of the features of something like ChatGPT is it's storing those histories, keeping that in the context, in an older context window in a very summarized format, so that then when I give it new prompts, it's not just going from the base model, it's going and seeing what it knows about me, what are my preferences, and it pulling that context window, all that prior context in, which makes it look like it knows me. If I just wiped all that out, I wouldn't have trained the model. I mean, the perception of that these are always learning is I think that's a little buzzwordy, that this model is always learning from your behaviors. It's technically not always learning. There's a period that is the building and modeling. And this is when, let's say, they take all of known human history and try to condense it down and train on, this is the way that language works, and this is all the books, and these are all the articles and everything. And it's creating that original base model for a large language model. That's when it's learning. Usually that's basically set and that is stored as a particular model, and then you're just interfacing with that model. And there might be following that, you might have some retraining, some like fine tuning, but that's always an iterative process, and it's done more offline. It's not as you're talking to it. And if of course, if we're talking about like voice agents and a voice bot that's taking an inbound call, as that call is happening, you might feel like that guy is learning from the prior parts of the conversation. It's not baking that learning into its base model. It's not. When it tells you it is, they're lying. What they might do is take all the conversations from a period of time and then either have humans rate, okay, this went well, this didn't, these strategies worked, these didn't, or have another AI model that kind of sits on top of that and does the regression testing to fine tune the original model and then update it and change it. But that's more of a incremental, like, periodic offline task. It's not the always learning, always on sort of paradigm that a lot of people try to say that the AI systems are doing today.
No, it can learn from the context, but that's within that context window of the particular conversation. It's within the ChatGPT thread itself, but it's not necessarily feeding the master model for future use.
Yeah, you have to, and that gets people, because then when they're told that the big models are being trained off of your conversations, they are being trained off of those conversations, yes, but not in real time, like not necessarily this or that conversation, and it's more like I said, offline. It's more of an iterative approach rather than literally an always on sort of learning experience.
So, for those that are actively using ChatGPT and these other tools, talk to me a little bit about prompt engineering and its importance in being able to actively leverage these tools and models.
Yeah. So you can't think of it in terms of that you're just programming something. It's not like calling a function. LLMs, they are predictive and statistical type of tools. They are not, I'm going to go back and use the word deterministic again. They're not deterministic. If you expect every time I say um, a knock knock joke that it's going to respond with the exact same punchline every time, like it's not necessarily, because it takes the possible outputs that it could give you, and then it's picking depending on, and there's dials that you can have turned up or turned down. How creative do you want this to be? Do you want it to just take whatever the single most likely output should be from your model, or do you let it kind of have a little bit more creativity? Turning it down all the way to zero creativity can end up with some very rigid, inflexible conversations. Too far on the other end, and now it's completely creative. It's become saying nonsensical things, and creative really isn't the right word. Random. It can become very random if you turn up that dial too much in the other direction. So of course, as we're thinking about chatbots, we want that dial turned pretty low, almost to zero, so far as the randomness that we allow it to have. But it does have to have a certain amount, otherwise it becomes a deterministic system, and it's not using the power of what an LLM should be used for. So think of variability, the variability of the output of LLMs, as just an inherent feature of those systems rather than an issue that, well, I need predictable outputs. If you need predictable, like if any times this is said that this is the response, then what you're looking for is not an LLM. What you're looking for is programming, is deterministic rules, which you can lay on top of your LLM, right? So you can have, when the LLM says this is the output that I want to create, before that gets produced and put out to a consumer, have something sitting on top of that, some code or a tree of possible logic that check that versus what it should be allowed to do, and then and stop it versus allowing it through.
Understood. So we talk about the prompt engineering. We talk about kind of context being king and being able to bring the
Mhm.
context to it. And how can we prompt engineer within these context windows? What capabilities do we ultimately have?
And it's the capabilities of your system. All of these are growing so much. They're growing every day, and I feel like building, not thinking of building an agent anymore, that it's more of a two heads are better than one sort of tool set that you should be thinking about building, where you have the agent broken into different roles. So you might have one role or one agent who's responsible for answering dispute questions, one that is responsible for payment arrangements or something like that, one that's got an overarching judge, the judge LLM that we've talked about before, that's making sure that everybody's following the rules based off of using that RAG that we talked about earlier, checking against the rule set, checking against your policies and procedures and the laws, and making sure that nobody has broken the rules among all of the LLMs that you've tried to implement, and really chaining these together to making them work. It becomes like although from a user experience, it feels like you're talking to one thing. In reality, there's a whole crew behind there, right? There's a whole army of agents doing their jobs.
We've also started talking about ecosystems and how these things like chain together and you can start using some of these tools as part of a larger ecosystem. And I think about it similar to the way that the industry has started to leverage omni-channel, because it's not just
Mhm.
about the communications through each one of those channels. It's about orchestrating the next best action and kind of the conglomeration of all the things that we've talked about today. How do you get it to say the right things, not hallucinate? How do you start bringing all of these systems together into one ecosystem to create a capability that the debt collection industry ultimately needs? And I know when you and I were first talking about it from a consulting standpoint, and then your move into CSS impact, as we started looking at, as you started telling me more about CSS, it sounds like you guys have started bringing together more of that, let's call it combined ecosystem environment. Talk to me a little about how, as an organization, you've brought these tools together for not siloed management, but for holistic integration.
Yeah. I I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be at CSS if they weren't doing this, honestly.
That's why I asked the question, right? Because it's not something I would normally ask on a podcast because it is a little bit more specific to your product. But that's what really interested me as you made that move over to CSS is to like, okay, all of these things actually work together in a cohesive ecosystem. What were like, how do you actually execute on that, and what kind of impact does that bring to the space?
Exactly. That's it's a beautiful thing when you see this symphony of tools that are all working together. I think it requires a constant dedication to the cause, a constant forward thinking, bleeding edge sort of mindset. I've had the great privilege of sitting in on R&D calls as that starting out as the new guy, the fly on the wall, and hearing all the things that we're talking about doing here in 2026, and how because we are a entire ecosystem of products, we have that power, that benefit. We have the data. You don't have a lot of collection systems these days that still have an integrated dialer, and not talking about a white label dialer, not talking about integrating a third party dialer, but our own dialer that is built by and for and within the collection system that we're working on. And thinking about then how powerful that is to be able to have that tight integration and have the call transcription just happening in real time, having that all of that call data stored in your database, having it be able to seamlessly query information about the account while calls are happening, and that the agent co-pilot experience, being able to have the control to build our own MCP to then interface with the account and take whatever actions that you can imagine that you would want an agent to be able to take on the account. It's not something that just happens. Not most systems or not every system thinks about how amazing of a tool set that you can make once you have your own integrated dialer, integrated texting, integrated emailing, and web portal and client portal. And there's this whole suite of products and voice collection agent, right? That are functioning together kind of all off the same core system with the same interface, the MCP that we were talking about. It's it's a beautiful thing.
It really is. It's unique to see everything coming together versus going to all of these different vendors for all of these different pieces and parts. But Rob, like every conversation that we have, I really appreciate you spending a little bit of time with me today to educate me not only on LLMs, judge LLMs, the MCP, which was something that I really had not thought about before or really considered about that additional layer between your system of record and all of these additional tools, but I do learn something. Thank you for sharing your insights with me again today.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam. It's always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. Let's do it again soon.
I know that we're going to do it again soon. For those of you that are watching, if you have additional questions you'd like to ask Rob or myself, you can leave those in the comments on LinkedIn and YouTube, and we'll be responding to those. Or if you have additional topics you'd like to see us discuss, you can leave those in the comments below as well. And I know I'm going to be able to get Rob back at least one more time to help me continue to create great content for a great industry. But until next time, Rob, I really appreciate all of your insights. Thank you for sharing with me today.
Thanks, Adam. Catch you next time.
And thank you, everybody, for watching. We appreciate your time and attention. We'll see you all again soon. Bye.